Hey guys, it's Dwayne here. So today I have a really special guest with us. Like I always say, if you don't know much about something, you know what you do, you bring in somebody who does. So today our special guest is going to be Pastor Matthew Everhard, and he's really smart when it comes to Jonathan Edwards, one of the great reformers, the resolved, that guy, that Jonathan Edwards. And so we're going to have a little discussion, kind of learn about who Jonathan Edwards is and what his contribution is to Christendom and all these other sorts of things. Pastor Matt, why don't you go ahead and say hello to everybody?
Well, hey, what's up, everybody? First of all, thank you so much for having me on the program today. Very excited to be here. For those of you who don't know, I am the pastor of Gospel Fellowship, PCA. We are a Reformed, Bible-believing, Christ-exalting church here just north of Pittsburgh, 20 minutes north or so of the city. If you're in the area, we'd love to have you come visit us for worship. We have services at 8:30 and 11. And hey, check this out, some breaking news. Can I break some news on your show today?
Absolutely. Break away.
Yeah, so the breaking news is that Gospel Fellowship and some of our other churches in the Ascension Presbytery, we are planting a new church in Evans City. Evans City is a growing little area here just west of our position, and it's going to be thriving. And we've just obtained some usage to the fire hall in Evans City, and so want to invite anyone that may be close to Zelian-Opal, Harmony, Evans City, to come do Bible study with us on Wednesday nights at the Evans City Fire Hall. So that's up and running, man. We're pumped to be starting off a new location. It's good news. Good news.
That's awesome. So that must have been a long time coming. I think I saw some stuff you posted a little while ago about praying for this church plant. So that's great.
Our presbytery has been wanting to do this for years now, and finally we kind of got it up and go in this particular area in our county. It is set to really go boom here in just a bit because there's developments planned everywhere. A lot of people moving into this particular area of the country. And so we just think if we can get a Bible study up and who knows, maybe Lord's Day worship services soon, then we're really going to grow into a nice church planting opportunity here.
Well, amen. I'm honored that you're breaking that news here. So that's great. So let's get into it. So Jonathan Edwards, I know a little bit about him. I wouldn't say I'm an expert or anything, but you've been studying him like for your life almost, right? Is that right? Tell us a little bit about yourself. Like what's with this interest in Jonathan Edwards? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, he's an interesting guy, and for me, this goes back, at least 10 years or so. I think I've been studying Edwards. John Piper is kind of the gateway drug for those of us who are Edwards scholars. Of course, people have been studying Edwards for a long time before John Piper started talking about him. But for me, I was doing doctoral research at Reformed Theological Seminary, and I needed a topic for my dissertation, and I went to the dissertation seminar. And the program director there, a guy by the name of Steve Childers, he told us something that I'll never forget. He said, pick a dissertation topic that will not only capture your interest for the next 3 or 4 years, but something that when you die and somebody's doing your funeral one day, they're going to say that this really changed your life. And so for me, I was going through a period of tremendous stress in the ministry, doctoral work, and my family was growing, and my church responsibilities were super stressful. And I just needed to focus on joy. And I knew that that was the fruit of the Spirit that the Lord was calling me to really delve into. And so looking for a project topic, I decided to study Jonathan Edwards' theology of joy or happiness or gladness, as it's variously called in the scriptures, rejoicing, that sort of an idea. And Piper had led me to know that Edwards, his writings are just filled with the concept of happiness and gladness and joy just everywhere in his sermons and his major treatises and his minor writings and his personal writings. And so I just went through Edwards' stuff and just started combing through it, looking for themes of happiness and rejoicing. And I ended up putting together my dissertation on Edwards' theology of joy with special pertinence to his doctrine of the Trinity. So that's how I cut my teeth. And since then, I continue to write and study on Jonathan Edwards. He's a wonderful person to delve into. If you're looking for a study interest, there's all kinds of stuff that you can do with Edwards studies. And because his works are so voluminous, there's so many areas that scholars can delve into without reduplicating each other's efforts. So it's a broad field. And if anyone's looking for a study interest, Edwards, there's all kinds of gold in the mines for you to go after. It's really awesome.
So now, in mentioning John Piper, I actually really like John Piper. I listen to him regularly. So he's come up. He didn't come up with it, but he's got this idea of Christian hedonism, that God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in Him. Is that like a Jonathan Edwards thing? Did that come directly from him, or?
Yeah, there are some things that Edwards said that are similar to that. Of course, that particular phrasing is John Piper's own calling card. But Edwards and Piper do have some overlap, and I think Piper would be the first to admit that he was inspired by some of the things that Edwards says about gladness and happiness. Of course, the phrase Christian hedonism is uniquely a John Piper coined a term. Edwards certainly says things like that from time to time. For instance, in one place in Miscellany number 3, Edwards talks about how humankind is created with a great capacity for happiness and gladness within the heart. That's something that's unique to us as human creatures, that we have this, let's just call it a tank in our heart that can be filled with joy. And Edwards, of course, says that along with Augustine and others as well who've observed this, that the heart is made to be filled with gladness, and that gladness is especially going to come in our knowledge of and relationship with God through Christ.
Now, Jonathan Edwards, he ministered kind of like, was it throughout the 1700s during the Great Awakening, and he was a Puritan. So can you kind of set the context for us, like what was happening in the Great Awakening, and what was the role of the Puritans in that?
Yeah, great question. So you can kind of think of Edwards as being positioned halfway between the Salem witch trials on one hand, which happened in the late 1600s, and then the American Revolution, which happened after Jonathan Edwards' lifetime. Of course, we think of 1776 for that event. And so if you take those two events in American history and kind of go to the center, then you're talking about the period of Edwards' own lifetime, which was 1703 to 1758. That's his birth and his death. And Edwards is a key historical figure during this time, not only as an excellent example of what colonial Puritanism looked like, but also for his role in the Great Awakening, which was America's great religious revival. And we can pin that revival primarily to the dates of 1740 to 1742. Really, those 2 years are kind of the heart and center of the revival. Although obviously there were some things that led up to that revival, and there were many things that reverberated after the revival. But Jonathan Edwards is right in the center of all of that. In fact, when you think of the Great Awakening here in America, we really tag that event to the shirts of two persons in particular. Jonathan Edwards is no doubt the theologian who best defined what it is that was happening in the Great Awakening. But then George Whitefield, the British evangelical Anglican itinerant preacher, is also central there as well. If Edwards was the thinker, then Whitefield was certainly the preacher. And those two knew each other. They met. Whitefield stayed at Edwards' home. And much of what happened in the Great Awakening centers around those two persons. A few other significant people as well, but certainly those two.
It's actually interesting that you bring up George Whitefield, because I think there's a little bit of controversy surrounding him because he had owned slaves at one point in his life. So is Jonathan Edwards kind of in the same sort of thing? Did he own slaves as well, or was he?
Yeah, he is. And so this would be one of those areas where we can look at some of these great men like Edwards and Whitefield, and we can find fault for them for what we might call historical or chronological blind spots. Just be careful, though, because the moment that we get on our moral high horse and we think we're looking down on these folks from the moral high ground, don't forget that chronological moral blind spots are something that happens to every single generation of Christians and every single generation of people. And this is why we need church history in our lives, because one generation can critique and inform the next. And so while on one hand, we can look at some of these guys and say, what was happening that they missed this. It seems so obvious to us
Right,
on
right.
the other side of some of these social rights movements. Yet they might look at our generation and they could critique us very seriously for some of our views on gender or sexuality or abortion, for instance. And so some of the things that the American church today might readily accept into our midst, even in our own membership, we might tolerate some of these things. They would
Yeah,
look at us aghast and say, how is it that you missed this particular blind spot?
right,
That seems as obvious to them, perhaps, as slavery seems to us. But yeah, there's a
right,
lot
right.
more that can be said about Edwards and slavery. I do have an article on modern Reformation on their web exclusive article site. If you go to modernreformation.org, you should be able to pretty quickly find my article on Edwards and slavery. I think that'll help put it in context
Yeah, yeah.
because while these guys did own slaves, there's some other background information that might help fill out the picture.
Yeah, and just for everyone else, I'll leave the link below of the article that Pastor Matt is talking about, and then you can go ahead and read that on your own time. After you watch this video, make sure you go and check out that article. Yeah, like cultural blind spots. Like you suggested, the whole idea of looking down on somebody. I mean, as Christians, that's not something we do anyway, right? Or at least we're not supposed to do. In getting back to Jonathan Edwards, he's, in my mind, he's kind of popular for two things, right? Or really well known for two things. One are his resolutions. There, I'm not sure how many there are. I think there were like just over 70. You probably have an exact number on there. And 70. And then the other thing that he's really famous for is his sermon, Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God. And I mean, I've read that one a couple of times and it is intense. So what were the circumstances surrounding that sermon, Sinners? And like you would almost go to say you probably wouldn't hear a sermon like that today, or at least they'd be very few and far between. So what led to the circumstances to that sermon?
Well, certainly this is probably the moment that Edwards is most famous for, the preaching of sinners in the hands of an angry God. And it's been reprinted in a number of anthologies that typify American literature from the period. And that's both interesting and unfortunate in some sense, because for those who read through American history, they're often given this one sermon as an example of what colonial Puritanism looked like. And in one sense, it's a great sermon. It's a wonderful sermon and certainly is typical of the period. On the other hand, though, it's only so unfortunate that other sermons are not included in these anthologies, because I do think it would really round out people's understanding of what Puritan preaching looked like. So, for instance, I always tell people that whenever you read Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, you should also read another sermon of Edwards called Heaven is a World of Love, because there you'll be able to also see Edwards's incredible preaching on the glories and beauties of heaven, just as intensely as his very vivid figures and images in Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. But a little bit can be said about that particular sermon. One thing is that Edwards actually preached it twice. Not a lot of people know that. The first time he preached it to his own congregation, the Church of Northampton, and apparently had very little effect on these people. They had heard Edwards preach a number of times. And of course, he was their regular pastor, preaching every Lord's Day and other times aside. And it was an unremarkable circumstance when Edwards first preached it at Northampton. But in the midst of the Great Awakening, some pastors began to itinerate and to visit one another's churches and chapels and preach in other places. And Edwards participated in that too. And when he went to another congregation, the congregation at Enfield, Connecticut, he preached the sermon, which was one of his file sermons. I mean, he'd done it before. He had it, in the bag, so to speak.
Yeah.
And the Lord poured out a tremendous revival in that very moment. People began to quake in the pews. People began to shake. Some people fell down. Other people cried out in terror. And this is most unusual for the Puritans, because we're not talking about here a group of Christians that we would call charismatics or Pentecostals, or even in those days, the Shaker movement, where you might see some things like that. These were people that were, they'd sat under hundreds and maybe thousands of sermons in their lives. and they were able to endure 2 to 3 hour sermons at a stretch without much response. Even the children were trained from a young childhood to sit dutifully in their pews and listen to the minister. But in this case, because of the attendance of the Holy Spirit's power, and because of the nature of the discourse itself, and because of what the Spirit was doing more broadly throughout the colonies, it landed with tremendous impact, and certainly is today considered the very epicenter moments of the Great Awakening, aside from some of Whitfield's own sermons as well.
And that there's like a really practical application to that sort of dichotomy between the two ways of preaching that. Because as preachers, we often get like, maybe we hear our own sermon afterwards and we think, oh, that didn't go over so very, very well, or I didn't feel like that was necessarily speaking to anybody. But then like the Lord is the one who does the moving in the hearts of the people. And so what we're seeing here with Jonathan Edwards in his most famous sermon is, he preached it once and it didn't work out. He preached it again and the Lord moved in the hearts of the people, and hence, the Great Awakening and all that. Like that's a really awesome lesson.